I had been driving for Lyft for several years, usually working the night shift. The roads were deserted, and the tips were good. But in return, sometimes incidents occurred that I could never forget, and not all of them were pleasant. I was always a cautious person. I had encountered all kinds of strange passengers, but what I'm about to tell you had never happened to me before. Back then I didn't have a dash cam in my car, and after that night, I immediately installed one. The night started like any other. It was just me and my old 2005 Volvo. Though old, it was incredibly reliable. The roads were empty, just the way I liked them. Around 2 a.m. I received a ride request from a nearby convenience store. Everything seemed fine, but I felt an unexplainable uneasiness in my gut. When I arrived at the location, I immediately understood why I felt that way. The store was closed. All the lights were off, and the parking lot was deserted. As I got closer, I saw him. He was pacing nervously outside the store, wearing an old, filthy hoodie that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. His movements were erratic, like he couldn't stand still. He kept glancing over his shoulder repeatedly, as if someone was following him. I should have stopped there. I should have canceled the ride, but for some reason I didn't. I unlocked the door, and without a word he got into the back seat. The moment I took my foot off the brake, I realized my mistake. Most passengers are either busy on their phones or looking out the window. But this guy? He just stared at me through the rearview mirror, unblinking, unmoving. To break the awkward silence, I turned on the radio. The moment the music started, he snapped. "Turn it off!" he barked. His voice was deep and rough, like that of a lifelong smoker. His reaction unsettled me, but I said nothing and turned the radio off, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a while there was silence. Then suddenly he spoke. "Ever pick up someone you shouldn't have?" His words hit me like a hammer. I forced a chuckle. "I hope not." But he didn't laugh. Instead he mumbled something under his breath. Something I couldn't make out. Then he told me he used to be an Uber driver, but he quit after some guys stole things from his car. I glanced at the mirror and saw that he was smiling. Not a normal smile, but something unsettling. Then he said, "Think about how much trust you put in a stranger, especially when they're sitting right behind you." A chill ran down my spine. At that moment, I no longer saw him as just a drunk or a weirdo. I saw him as a potential threat. Suddenly he shouted, "You missed the turn!" But according to the GPS, we were on the right path. Startled, I slammed the brakes. "Pull over!" he demanded, his voice cold and firm. With shaking hands, I pulled the car to the side of the road. Just then, a police car appeared in my rearview mirror. Its headlights flooded my car, and immediately the man slumped down in the back seat, as if trying to hide. A few seconds passed. Then, he slowly lifted his head and whispered, "Tonight you're lucky." Then, without warning, he opened the door and disappeared into the darkness. That night, I ended my shift early. A few days later, I read the news. A convenience store had been robbed that same night, at the same time and in the same area. My heart pounded as I realized I had been inches away from a potentially dangerous criminal. Now I'm much more careful about who I let into my car. Grabbed it impulsively, but I admit I had never been treated that way by a neighbor before. It wasn't anything crazy, but it wasn't something I was used to. I thanked her as I took the basket, and she looked at me like she was expecting me to say something else. I honestly didn't know what else to say, so I just smiled. She kept staring at me awkwardly, which confirmed my suspicion that this woman didn't interact with a lot of people. Eventually she spoke. She said these exact words which I'll never forget. "Always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe." It wasn't something a normal person would say to someone else. It was like she was reciting from a rule book. It honestly sounded more like a warning than advice. I nodded, smiled, and turned to go back inside. After shutting the door, I stood there in silence, waiting to hear her footsteps walk away. She didn't walk away for a good 45 seconds, which was probably the strangest part about the whole interaction. Despite the weird vibe, I did appreciate her kindness. She seemed reclusive but not unfriendly, the kind of person who'd help you if you asked but wouldn't go out of her way to pry. I told myself it was nice to know someone was close by, even if I didn't plan on needing her. I didn't even bother looking in the basket. I just set it down in the living room and forgot about it. There was a thunderstorm that night, which is extremely rare for Oregon, but it does happen. I lit a few candles and curled up on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the fact that the power was flickering every few minutes. Some of you might find that kind of isolation scary, but I actually loved it. For some reason, my brain wasn't freaked out by the natural sounds of the thunderstorm. It was actually that specific storm that gave me that realization. I listened intently to everything outside, and dare I say, it was soothing. But of course, that peaceful feeling didn't last. A few hours after the storm started, there was a knock at the door that nearly made me jump out of my skin. I say knock, but it was really more of a banging. It was loud and definitely not natural, like whoever it was didn't care that it was pouring outside. My heart started pounding, and I began to feel that god-awful tingly sensation in my chest. After hesitating for a few seconds, I grabbed the flashlight and got up to check who it was. I looked through the little glass window pane next to the door. It was Michelle, soaked to the bone and clutching a flashlight. I opened the door and she spoke before I even had a chance to greet her. She blurted out that she saw someone near my woodpile and that I should know about it. I was beyond confused, but her words were incredibly concerning, and that took precedence. I stepped out onto the porch, shining my flashlight into the rain, but I couldn't see anything. Anything but trees. I asked her if she was sure, and she nodded. Her eyes kept darting to the woods like she was expecting someone to emerge from it any second. The whole thing was pretty freaky. I kept looking around, but there wasn't much I could make out between the darkness and the chaos of the storm. Before I could say anything else, she told me to be careful and began walking away without waiting for a response. I watched her head back down the path toward her cabin, clearly unfazed by the pouring rain. I stood there until the glow of the flashlight disappeared out of sight, and then I went back inside. The literal second I shut the door, I realized her story was riddled with holes. How could she have seen someone near my woodpile if her house was 10 minutes away? She must have been on my property to begin with. Why the hell would she be snooping around my cabin during a thunderstorm? Was she lying? It didn't sit right with me, but marching over to her house in the middle of a thunderstorm was the last thing I was going to do. Still, I had to do something. I locked up the cabin as securely as I could and sat in my room listening. The storm started to die down after a while, but I still felt pretty uneasy. A few more hours passed without incident, so I decided that it was probably safe to go to sleep. I can't remember exactly what time it was, but sometime after midnight I woke up to the sound of a branch snapping just outside my bedroom window. I'm a really light sleeper, so I was 100% positive it was a branch snapping and not something else. I froze in place for a few tense seconds, listening. Eventually I crept to the window, half hoping I wouldn't see anything. At first I didn't, but then I spotted her, Michelle. She was standing at the edge of the woods, her body angled away from my house. I could tell it was her because her hair was so long and disheveled. I strained to make out more, but with only moonlight to help me see, it was no use. I saw her beginning to turn around, so I ducked beneath the window before she could catch me looking at her. I stayed crouched there for what felt like forever, until I finally mustered the courage to peek again. She was gone. I genuinely didn't know what to do. I hadn't exactly pegged her as dangerous, just weird. But at that point I was having second thoughts. It didn't make sense. Why would she try and warn me earlier if she was the one poking around? I didn't sleep for hours. I was pretty dead set on just staying up until sunrise. A few hours passed, and I was starting to get tired. As I finally began letting my guard down, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't like the banging from earlier, it was actually kind of quiet. Still, I wasn't going to get up under any circumstances. The pins and needles started up again as I quietly made my way over to the door. I took an inconspicuous glance through the pane and froze in horror. It wasn't Michelle. It was a burly-looking, bald guy with a thick beard. I had to fight every bone in my body not to yell out in fear. The situation instantly went from a 6 to a 10. As quietly as I could, I retreated to my bathroom, locked the door, and called the police. As I was on the phone with them, I started to hear banging on the front door, like someone was repeatedly smashing it with a heavy object. The operator told me help was on the way and instructed me not to hang up. I sat there, more terrified than I'd ever been in my entire life. Eventually the front door gave way and I heard it crash open. I genuinely thought I was going to die. That man, whoever he was, started smashing things in my cabin. At least that's what it sounded like. All I could hear was the sound of glass breaking and wood splintering. I didn't dare make a sound. Luckily, that man didn't seem to look for me because I never heard his footsteps leave the living room. Eventually, the smashing stopped, and I was sitting in complete silence again. It had become a small tradition, something Catherine and I looked forward to every year, our late-night Christmas drive. It wasn't Christmas Eve or Christmas Day that I loved the most, but that quiet time together on the road. The route from my house to hers wasn't a major highway, just a series of back roads lined with fields, trees, and the occasional farmhouse. Since it was always late, we rarely saw other cars, making it feel as if the world was asleep, leaving just the two of us. Every time we blasted Juice WRLD, a shared obsession since we met. Some might call his music cringy, but there was something special about singing along together, completely in sync. This past Christmas Eve started just like the others. After a night with my extended family, we packed up my car around midnight and set off. The snow was falling lightly, the roads were empty, and with the music and heat turned up, everything felt perfect. Until suddenly, it wasn't. What happened next was one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. As I was driving, my phone rang, interrupting the music. Annoyed, I glanced down to see an unknown number and ignored it, assuming it was a scam call. Catherine joked about how committed telemarketers must be to call on Christmas, and we laughed it off. But then, a few minutes later, my phone rang again. It was the same unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, feeling slightly uneasy. Catherine noticed and gave me a confused look, but I just shrugged. When my phone rang for the third time, irritation turned to anger. Frustrated, I grabbed my phone and answered aggressively, ready to tell off whoever was spamming me. My sudden movement startled Catherine, but I didn't care. I barked, "Hello?" expecting some scam script, but instead, I was met with silence, then faint static. Just as I was about to hang up, a calm, unfamiliar male voice spoke. "Hello, Luke." A chill ran down my spine. I nearly swerved off the road. My body tensed with nervous energy, my mind racing to make sense of it. Before I could respond, the man began reciting personal information. My full name, my address, and details about my life that no stranger should know. I wanted to pull over, but I kept driving, trapped in a surreal trance. My first instinct was to yell, to demand answers, but instead I forced myself to stay calm and asked, "What do you want?" The pause before he responded made my blood run cold. "I'm not here for you," he said. "I'm here for Catherine." Hearing her name was far worse than hearing my own. I turned to Catherine, and the sheer terror on her face told me she was just as shocked as I was. I blurted out that he must have the wrong number, that I didn't know a Catherine, but the man chuckled. "He's sitting right next to you," he said. That was it. I pulled over immediately, my hands shaking. I was about to speak when, without hesitation, Catherine reached over and hung up the call. I stared at her in shock before exploding. "Why did you hang up?" I practically shouted. A stranger had just made personal threats against us, and she had cut him off. But she didn't answer. She just stared at me with wide, fearful eyes. I tried calling the number back. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. Catherine urged me to keep driving, and though I eventually did, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. She said she was scared, and I couldn't blame her, but something about it didn't sit right. There had been moments in our relationship where trust was fragile. White lies, half-truths, little things that made me question. I knew I was being paranoid, but I couldn't help but wonder. The rest of the drive was silent. No music, no conversation, just the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on both of us. Even when we reached Catherine's driveway, I didn't feel any safer. It's been almost a month since that night, and I still have no answers. We asked our families. They weren't responsible. Catherine swears she doesn't know anything, and yet the fact remains. No one outside our families knew we would be on that road. I can't stop thinking about it. Every time my phone rings, I brace myself. I know he's going to call me again. It's just a matter of time.